Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Cowan-Smith. Tonight, the African Union suspends Sudan over the brutal crackdown on protesters earlier this week. Pro-democracy campaigners say that at least 108 people were killed. Also, FIFA's vice president and the head of the Confederation of African Football is held for questioning in Paris. Madagascar's Ahmed has been caught up in an investigation into corruption. And we meet some of the top flight sportswomen from Cameroon, South Africa and Nigeria getting ready to battle it out in the Women's World Cup, which kicks off here in France on Friday. But first, the African Union suspended Sudan until civilian rules brought in. It's also threatened sanctions. The bloc's responding to a brutal crackdown on protesters by security forces in Khartoum on Monday. Demonstrators say that 108 people were killed. Authorities admit to only 61. A military council has been running the country since the overthrow of President Omar al-Bashir back in April. Ethiopia's leader will be meeting with Sudan's ruling generals and members of the opposition on Friday to try and mediate in stalled talks on a civilian-led transition to power in the country. In the meantime, the interruption of constitutional rule has led to an international backlash.
The international pressure on Sudanese leaders is mounting over the deadly military crackdown on protesters. Thursday, the African Union suspended Sudan with immediate effect.
We decide as Council to suspend, as of today, the participation of the Republic of Sudan in all AU activities till the effective establishment of a civilian-led transitional authority as the only way to allow the Sudan to exit from the current crisis.
And the African Union isn't the only one pressuring military leaders this week. The United States condemned the recent attacks on protesters and called on rulers to desist from violence. The United Arab Emirates, a key supporter of Sudan's ruling generals, called for talks to resume. And the United Nations urged all parties to act with the utmost restraint.
What is clear to us is that there was use of excessive force by the security forces on civilians. People have died. People have been injured. It is a basic human right for people to be able to demonstrate freely and peacefully, and that right needs to be respected.
On Wednesday, the military council did offer to reopen negotiations, but that was rejected by protest leaders who are demanding justice for all the demonstrators killed since Monday.
Police in Malawi used tear gas on demonstrators who accused President Peter Mutharika of having rigged last month's election. The leader was narrowly re-elected, and opposition parties say that irregularities in the polls included ballot sheets that were altered using Tipex. The Electoral Commission greenlit Mutharika's win, but protests have gathered momentum since this Tuesday. And 2 Canadian women have been abducted outside of a hostel in Ghana. A pair of charity workers were taken on Tuesday evening in the city of Kumasi. They'd reportedly been travelling in an Uber with another woman and were snatched as they exited the car. Police and the Canadian Foreign Ministry are still investigating. Kidnappings are relatively rare in the country, although there was an uptick of them in Ghana at the end of last year. Cameroon's Anglophone crisis has cost at least 1,800 lives and displaced over 500,000 people. Since a bid for more autonomy from Anglophone regions began in about late 2016, before escalating into violence around 2017, the conflict has spawned horrifying stories of brutality, both from security forces and armed separatists in the English-speaking northwest and southwest. The United Nations reckons that 1.3 million people are in need, and yet the emergency is not met with much international attention. Well, for more on this, we're joined by Ilaria Allegrozzi from Human Rights Watch. Ilaria, thanks so much for coming in to speak to us. Now, why do you think that the situation in Cameroon is escalating from its origins in 2016, 2017.
Yeah, you're totally right. The situation in the Anglophone regions of Cameroon is getting out of control, is spiraling in a cycle of violence, which has claimed so many lives. And since the beginning of the year, especially, we have seen an escalation in the number of civilian deaths and attacks perpetrated by both the security forces and armed separatists. The reason behind this escalation is due to the crackdown by the government forces, which is radicalizing and creating more frustration among the communities. And I think with this pace of violence, attacks and destruction, the situation is set to get worse before it gets any better. And the crisis can turn into a full-fledged conflict if swift action is not taken immediately.
And it's often so there's a lot of concern about the civilians are caught up in the middle of this. But bearing in mind it's a secessionist bid, it's for independence for the English-speaking regions. Why are civilians being targeted by both security forces and the separatists who assumedly come from these communities?
Exactly. Civilians have been caught in the middle between two fires and they've been victim of abuses by both sides. The government targets civilians because they suspect them of collaborating with armed separatists. And the separatists target them for different reasons, for kidnapping for ransom, for example. They target students and teachers because they want to enforce a boycott on education. And since the beginning of the crisis, attacks on educations have been escalating, and so many school buildings have been destroyed, vandalized, and burned down. There was an episode, a case which we documented in our latest report in March, which concerned the kidnapping of up to 170 students, mostly girls and mostly minors, in Kumbo, in one city in the northwest, kidnapped by the separatists and released a few days later. An incident which didn't really make it to the headlines and was as serious as the kidnapping of Chibok girls in Nigeria. This is just one example, but also from the government side, there have been violence and abuses, destruction of homes. Hundreds of homes have been burned down in security operations, abusive security operations, which have targeted civilians, especially because they were seen as collaborators of the Amba boys.
Bearing in mind the scale of the emergency in Cameroon, why do you think that there isn't more attention given to what's happening there?
I think one of the reasons why there's not enough attention and enough media coverage of what's happening in Cameroon is exactly because the government is trying to restrict the flow of information coming from the Anglophone regions, and also restricting in general freedom of expression. As you know, free speech is an indicator of how the government tolerates dissenting opinions, and is also an indicator on how the government takes human rights seriously or not. The government has tried to block journalists and also to block human rights organizations, which was our case. I was denied access to Cameroon in April this year, and since then I was unable to go back.
Now, Cameroon's not just dealing with the Anglophone crisis. There's also attacks from Boko Haram. There's also a political crisis. Where does the Anglophone crisis sit in this overall landscape of pressures on the country's security forces?
Yeah, you're right. The country is going through one of the most difficult periods of its history, facing Boko Haram in the far north, battling armed separatists in the Anglophone regions, and also dealing with 200,000 Central African refugees in the eastern border. And in addition to that, you have a political crisis ongoing, which is turning into a real crackdown on opposition. Since January, hundreds of supporters and members of the main political party have been arrested and are still behind bars.
Okay, thank you very much, Ilaria Aligotzi, coming in to speak to us there. The president of the African Football Confederation and the vice president of FIFA, the same man, is being questioned by French authorities. Ahmed Ahmed's believed to have been detained as part of a criminal investigation into corruption, but details are hard to come by. Simon Harding from our sports desk is here with more. Simon, this is a pretty unwelcome tarnish to FIFA just ahead of the Women's World Cup. What do we know about why Ahmed was taken in on Thursday?
Well, very little at the moment, Georgia, it must be said. It's relatively similar to all cases that come in football's governing body, which is about corruption, whether misuse of public funds. The allegations against Ahmad Ahmad, the head of CAF, importantly at the time now, as you were saying, is that he negotiated contracts with Puma which weren't legitimate, and he also did not spend enough or didn't have enough invested in the VAR system, video referee system, and there's all this kind of allegations around it. So he is being questioned by French authorities regarding that. The problem is this comes at a very bad time for CAF. I think it's more of an issue for the Confederation of African Football than it is for FIFA, because he is the president. The Africa Cup of Nations is just around the corner, and there's also a whole series of events that's going on at the moment regarding CAF that are putting them in a really bad spotlight. Their flagship event in the Champions League is having to be replayed because of allegations of corruption and rigging in the game there. So it's the equivalent of the Champions League here in Europe, so one of the biggest events. Journalists who are going to go to the Africa Cup of Nations have had their accounts hacked today, including some of us here at France 24. So it's all happening in a period where Ahmad Ahmad was banking on African football to host the Africa Cup of Nations, for it to be an exceptional event, and yet all the preparation that's going, it's just 3 weeks away, is really putting a downer on what's going on, and he himself being questioned is very negative for him, for football in general. As you were saying, he's also vice president of FIFA, but more importantly for African football as it approaches the Women's World Cup and the Africa Cup of Nations.
Thanks very much, Simon Harding, there for us. Well, as Simon mentioned, we are on the brink of the Women's World Cup. That kicks off on Friday. Top-level sports people from around the world are descending on the country for that tournament. Our Rosie Collier and RFI English team went to catch up with Nigeria's Francisca Ortega.
That's it. One more.
My name is Francisca Ortega. I'm 25 years old and I'm a forward. I love traveling. I love playing different leagues to experience kind of different culture, meet different people. I just want to experience Chinese league. I've been in America for 4 years, so I think I needed a change.
Oh, yes. Oh, my God, you're so good to work with.
This is my third World Cup. This year, I think there's a lot of improvement in terms of sponsors, the advertisements, the marketing, everything is just wow. Like compared to 2015, the organization, everything is perfect. Our first game will be against Norway, and I'm super excited. I can't wait for that day to come, but I don't really know much about them. I know about me and my teammates. It's like a war. You're coming for a war, so everyone is well prepared. So when we get to the field, then we know what's up right now.
Okay, exactly as you were doing. That last pose was really good.
Well, Nigeria is one of 3 African teams who'll be battling out in the 8th edition of the Women's World Cup over the next month or so. Cameroon and South Africa are also in the mix, a solid showing from African squads reflecting a growing support of female sports people across the continent. Take a look.
This is Africa's top women's football team. Nigeria's Super Falcons have been the most dominant squad on the continent over the past 30 years, winning a record 11 Women's Africa Cup of Nations. They've also played in all 8 Women's World Cups, but only reached the knockout stage once in 1999. Led by a Swedish coach since 2018, the Super Falcons are aiming to do better this year. But they faced host nation France, as well as South Korea and Norway in the group stages.
We really want to come to the knockout stage, and from there we will see what happens.
He wants us to play in the 3-5-2 formation. I think that's been our best formation for now. I think it's a great improvement for the team.
Cameroon are playing their second World Cup. In Canada in 2015, they reached the round of 16, and this year hope to go further. They first have to fight their way through a fairly balanced group, consisting of New Zealand, Canada and the Netherlands. Known as the Indomitable Lionesses, they make no secret of it. They're hungry to win.
We're working really hard to go as far as we can and bring back the trophy.
Like all lionesses going out hunting, we're on a hunt and we'll get our prey, because a lioness never comes home empty-handed.
Last but not least, South Africa play in their very first World Cup in France. They face powerhouses Germany and China, as well as Spain in the group stages. But Banyana, the girls in Sesotho, shouldn't be underestimated. They have 2018 Coach of the Year Desiree Ellis and Player of the Year Thembi Kgatlana on their side.
Today you are good, tomorrow you are better, and on the other day you're even greater. So yes, people are saying we're in a group of death, but I mean, by the time we get to the World Cup, we would be good together as a team, and they wouldn't know what to expect from us.
Performed really well at the African Women's Championships. We know that this is a couple of levels up, but with the same attitude, with the same commitment, with the same dedication. We're going there to compete.
No African team, male or female, has ever gone past the World Cup quarter-finals. For some, this might seem like an impossible feat, but these teams are more committed than ever to represent their continent on the world stage.
With the tournament on our doorstep, France 24 will, of course, be following the Women's World Cup closely, so do tune in for updates on that from Friday if you can. Either way, that's the end of it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care.